you so much for coming out to this month's Think and Drink. My name is Caroline Deemer, and I am the programming coordinator here. So Think and Drinks, for you guys who might not know, are a free monthly speaker series that happen on the first Thursday evening of every month. This year, in celebration of the USS Covia's 80th launch anniversary, we are having a year of talks related to often untold or forgotten stories from World War II. I would like to, before I let our speaker take it away, thank our sponsor, the Wisconsin Humanities Council. They're one of the main reasons that we can bring these talks to you guys and make sure that they're free and available both here in person and online. The Wisconsin Humanities Council strengthens our democracy through cultural programs that build connections and understanding between all people of all backgrounds and beliefs throughout the state. So thank you so much to Wisconsin Humanities Council. And tonight we got a really awesome talk. We've got a really awesome speaker. We got Dr. Karl Brown from UW-Whitewater, and I'll let him take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for that intro. And also, thank you for this invitation. I love to get out and talk to folks about my work. Now, she first asked me to say something about beer in World War II. I was like, Caroline, that's kind of boring. World War I's where it's at. But I did some research and I found some things on World War II as well. I've got sort of four topics I want to address here. That is, starting with temperance, looking at World War I, and then looking at all the various causes of prohibition. They'll finish up with World War II. I think that as I got to researching this topic and thinking about it, I think that but propaganda is front and central, of course, for both Prohibition and for World War I and for World War II. And I got to think about comparing, propaganda during wartime versus peacetime and sort of the various motives and things behind it. So I hope we'll have those themes in mind, and looking forward to your questions after the talk. Yeah. Okay, so let me start my stopwatch because I tend to talk really, really long if I'm not keeping track. Here we go. All right, Prohibition, propaganda, and war from those years in question. Okay, first off, if you like this talk, read this book, America Walks Into a Bar by Christine Sismondo. It is a history of the U.S. From its origins and our sometimes problematic relationship with alcohol and consumption throughout this period. So I want to start off with two what I call prohibition myths. I think that these are two things that most people, if you ask them what they know about prohibition, these are two things they're going to say, right? First off, that it was Carrie Nation and all these crazy old ladies with hatchets hacking up bars. It's their fault. They're the party poopers. They do not have fun. And then the other, I think, conception that prohibition didn't work. And I want to make the case that in some ways, some important ways, it actually did. Okay, so let's start off with the temperance movement itself, right? Now, drinking by the late 19th century was mostly in saloons, and these are think about like your modern dive or something. This is what most saloons looked like, right? People drank, but men specifically drank to excess in them. And this is sort of the origins of the foundations of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, in 1873. This is women who were concerned about men, wasting the household income on alcohol, domestic abuse, violence, things like that. The temperance came in also, women don't have the vote at this point. So this is one of the few ways that they can have any political agency, right? That is, they can enter the public sphere as long as under the auspices of sort of their traditional roles as mothers concerned about their children and society, right? It's not surprising then that there's some real crossover between the WCTU and the suffragist movement founded in Seneca Falls in 1848, right? These are women who are advocating the suffragists are actively agitating for the vote. WCTU temperance activists are agitating for to get rid of saloons, which they see rightly in some ways as the source of many social ills, right? So here's Carrie Nation sort of did this representation of how she had bartenders running scared when she walked into a bar and pulled out her axe. She was actually a really cunning user of her sort of her story in the press. That is, she would buy a new hatchet, sign it, and sell those for money to bankroll WCTU activities thereafter. Way to go, Carrie. So iconography for the WCTU. This is sort of a more traditional sort of Joan of Arc type figure. And we can see the same sort of equestrian woman figure in the early women's suffrage advertisements, in this case for the March on Washington in 1913, right? Most of the propaganda, though, is more these sort of appeals to again, sort of to the family, right? The choice here should be obvious. Rather than this fat cat brewer doesn't need your money, you should vote for prohibition to do it for the children. Of course, this mantra we see throughout sort of like a propaganda throughout the ages. On the right, again, likewise, vote dry for us. It's not just for the children; it's also the patriotic thing to do in this case, right? I have to find out the story on this one because I'm not sure what's going on. But apparently, even children themselves became dipsomaniacs, alcoholics, and this is why temperance prohibition was necessary. Again, do it for the children. Using children as sort of like the central focus of propaganda, sort of playing on the heartstrings of the viewers, right? Temperance coupled this propaganda campaign with posters, with also composing songs about temperance. In this case, the lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine. And the funny thing about this is that the Edison Studios made a film with the same title as kind of a satire or a spoof of the WCTU. Again, it was Carrie Nation and her sisters did have some impacts, I mean, especially on the bars that they attacked, but they were also satirized in the public eye. That is, the WCTU was widespread within 20 years after its foundation, but as yet it hadn't had much effect, right? The map here is of the United States. The white regions are dry. Black ones are ones that where you can still buy alcohol. The local option, the crosshatch one, that's where individual counties could go dry rather than the entire state doing so. This, of course, isn't terribly effective, as somebody wanting to get a drink could just drive to the next county over, right? But this is sort of the status of prohibition as of 1893. So I want to show you another propaganda image, not too different from the WCTU temperance images we've seen before, but this was a product of the ASL, the Anti-Saloon League, as is this one. This is one of my favorite ones. Is that you, Daddy? Sorry, it's not. I mean, it's funny, but it's also addressing a real social issue, right? Drunkenness was a real problem for many families in the late 19th century. So enter the ASL, 1893. It's noteworthy in as much as probably the first modern political lobby that is a single issue organization dedicated to try and get legislation passed in their interest. The closest parallel today is probably the NRA, I think, in terms of they'll back anybody as long as they are in favor of their interpretation of the Second Amendment. So they have a lot more money than the WCTU. They are able to spread the propaganda much more widely, and they convince a number of local governments to impose to seize this local option again for counties, townships, even cities to go dry, even as the rest of the state remained wet. At this time, also keep in mind that for Pullman Corporation and many other companies, they had company towns, and these towns were also dry. So not only did you have to live in the town built by your employer, you couldn't even get a drink, right? The ASL is very, very successful in this measure. That is, by what is the date on here? 1910. Look at the temperance has spread, or prohibition has spread widely throughout the country. This is well before the passage of the Volstead Act. On the eve of World War I, half of the U.S. was already dry. I mean, prohibition did not happen overnight. There's this backstory of decades of activism by temperance activists in the ASL that was, overall pretty effective in terms of how unpopular this was among many members of the population. So, to sum up this part of the story, temperance, beginning with the WCTU, then followed by the ASL, begins to move towards prohibition well before prohibition proper, and they're actually pretty successful on the eve of World War I, right? Now, the problem for making any further inroads is that the brewers in the U.S., these are some of the major moneymakers, and they're also the major sources of government revenue in the form of taxation. So in terms of a federal ban on alcohol, there's no way the federal government is going to, can't afford to impose prohibition throughout the country. This changes in 1913 with the introduction of the 16th Amendment. Personal income taxes replace corporate taxes as the major source of revenue for the U.S. government, and this all of a sudden makes temperance much more thinkable on the part of lawmakers. They can get away with it because the money from alcohol isn't as important to government as it was previously, right? The same year, the Webb-Kenyon Act closes the interstate loophole where you cannot transport alcohol across state lines. And so these, I think, both economically and legally, these are pretty important steps towards prohibition coming along after the war, right? Temperance activism on the first hand, and then the economic motive here, and then the economic motive for the government not thinking about prohibition is pretty much removed by 1913. Let's get into some World War I propaganda. Let's start with one from a German. This is well, according to this German artist, what do you think is the major threat to European peace? Not a trick question. It's that big bestial Russia in the east, right? Just threatening to gobble down Europe, if not for the brave efforts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Germans. The French and British don't even know what they're doing. The Italians, don't ask me why it looks that way. I have no idea why Serbia is a pig. Actually, I have a hypothesis on that, but I'll share it later. So World War I ushers in a boatload of propaganda by all sides. I want to start with some British propaganda because, as we'll see, it's very similar to what we'll see later from the Americans. On the left, the archetypal "Daddy, what did you do during the Great War?" Right, and you can tell from his sort of like pensive, defeated look that he didn't do anything. He stayed home and didn't give his share. I mean, his son is going to grow up to be a good little warmonger, right? He's playing with his toy soldiers and cannons and whatnot. But this is sort of using notions of masculinity as a way of shaming men into joining the battle, right? Meanwhile, hey guys, don't worry, the army isn't all work. I mean, sure, you're going to spend half the time getting cut in half by machine gun bullets or coughing up your lungs from mustard gas. But the rest of the time, you can play some cricket or the sport that everyone else calls football, Americans call soccer, right? So playing upon notions of masculinity as a means of convincing the audience, right? Same thing for women, calling on traditional female roles. That is that we're going to conserve. We're going to try to do everything we can to provide the troops in the field all the resources they need. Right, so traditional female roles, also some new ones though. That is, as with the shortage of manpower, women were brought into roles. Here with the Australian Army Auxiliary Corps, you could be the girl behind the man, behind the gun. My favorite slogan ever. And women also would take the place of farmers who were, off fighting in the fields in World War I. So this is kind of these sort of like staples of propaganda going back to 1914. Of course, the U.S. isn't in the war yet, but once we join, we get on board with the same types of thing. The classic Uncle Sam, I want you for the right hand pointing. I want you for the U.S. Army. Boy, that's familiar, doesn't it? The exact same iconography is used by the British and even the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. So there's a way in which these images are sort of transcend national borders, right? So we appeal to masculinity and other traditional gender roles. We demonize the enemy, of course, destroy this mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army, beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds, and then, and of course, one of the reasons that these foes are threats, because they threaten our women folk, right? Here we have this sort of King Kong looking figure with this helpless woman struggling in his grasp. Shaming men into joining the war. If I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it, right? Just explicitly calling upon manhood. And the image on the right, we can't quite see it in this picture, but at the bottom of the ocean, there, the Kaiser is storming across with his bloody sword. Those are the bodies of women and children carpeting the seafloor, right? So again, women and children are endangered. We have to do our part to protect them, okay? Now, these propaganda was deployed for a remarkable number of different purposes. On the one hand, go to the library. Read a book. not a commonplace wartime suggestion to soldiers. And on the right, I need smokes more than anything else, right? Tobacco. Also something we should conserve so that the boys in the field can get what they need, right? In the U.S. Now, we don't join the war until 1917, but when we do, we go gangbusters on it, right? Wilson founds the CPI, or the Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, who gets from, I think he was working as an advertiser for Ford Motor Campaign, I think, at the time. So straight from industry into government, and he and his propagandists were responsible for many of the images that we just now saw, but also the so-called 4-minute men. That is, speakers who would go from town to town, over 5,000 different cities throughout the course of the war, 750,000 lectures explaining to people the necessity of joining this war, even though it's all the way across the Atlantic. Many Americans had to be convinced, and this was an up close and personal, face-to-face way of doing so. Of course, as of March 1918, the so-called Spanish flu is just getting going. Somewhat ironically, this measure designed to drum up support for the war is also a major vector in the spread of this disease. Here's a Liberty Loan parade in September, which after the pandemic, I don't think anybody's going to look at, not just shudder, right? Let's get all these people together and all those germs to get support for the war. The war finally ends. Let's throw a big old party. Let's all go into the public streets and share our victory and our bacteria. All right. So somewhat a bit ironic there, I suppose, but propaganda worked, right? In World War I, the U.S. was able to drum up support for the war, and let's see how. And here's what happens with alcohol during the war. This nationalism and this propaganda messaging is deployed not only for books and cigarettes, but also for prohibition. That is, the anti-German sentiment, as I think is the other key element going into prohibition, right? That is, if you think about the owners of most American breweries, Pabst, Schlitz, Budweiser, Heilemann, all German names across the board, right? Early 1918, also that there were links discovered between the German-American Association, widely seen as a patsy for the Kaiser, and the U.S. Brewing Association. So this then provides a sort of a direct link between these so-called enemies of the state. They just happen to be German as well. The other sort of corollary effect of World War I is that grain rationing is imposed so that we can, again, supply the troops with bread. This was on the alcohol side, though. This leads to distilleries being shut down entirely for the entire war, and breweries had to greatly limit their output, right? So many breweries are struggling financially even before prohibition comes along. They simply can't get the grain they need to brew their beer, right? The anti-German sentiment is apparent here. Sermons will hang together. Okay. Right. I mean, this is, and then we have this report from the BOI, the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor of the FBI. One of their surveillance informants in a saloon in Milwaukee discovered that the Pabst Brewery workers are practically all socialists and pro-German, and many of them say they recognize no flag but the red flag. Right. So again, this sort of this threat of subversion of Germans, of socialists, or God forbid communists, all wrapped up with, again, with alcohol, right? We have a couple of kids doing their patriotic duty right here. To hell with the Kaiser. And just in case there's any question about it, spelling it out. If you're pro-saloon, you are a traitor to your country. Americanist becomes wrapped up with temperance, with prohibition, with banning alcohol, right? Even when the war is over. Alcohol, that says booze there on that. So not in the peace treaty, but still your enemy, right? The war against the Hun is over. Now we got to focus on alcohol. So prohibition then does finally go into effect in 1920. The Volstead Act is passed in 19. Prohibition itself goes January 1st, 2020, and it lasts for the next 13 years, right? So I think it's tempting to argue, and something I want to look at more. I'm not sure how to go about doing this. Is it seems to me that the U.S. got into World War I, got this massive propaganda machine fired up, and the war ends. But there's already these tools for manufacturing consent, for getting Americans to do what the government tells them to, that the government, having invented them in wartime, is more than willing to use them in peacetime, right? I want to prove this point by taking a slight detour in the history of plant pathology, and this has to do with the barberry eradication program, the biggest government program most of you I bet have not heard of, right? Long story short, barberry is a plant that is originally from the Old World. It was, and actually it goes back thousands of years, being cultivated by humans. It has a number of uses. Its wood is good for tool handles. You can make fruit from its berries. And that's a really pretty plant as well. It's also, unfortunately, the host for the disease Puccina graminis, or black rust of cereal crops. That is the disease would overwinter on the barberry bush and then spread into the crops in the spring. And By 1916, this is wiping out more than half the crop in the Dakotas, almost that in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. We're already rationing grain for the war, and this is a major threat to grain production, right? Predictably, let's go ahead and use this propaganda machine that we've built up. Let's go ahead and use it on a plant disease. Here we have this demonic black stem rust, destroyer of the wheat crop. This other demonic black stem rust demon threatening the crop as well. Guess what? It isn't just a plant disease. The barberry bush is akin to the Kaiser, right? So it's more of his dastardly activities here, right at home, right in our own backyards and fields, right? The image on the left is a memo from, I think, the South Dakota extension, with sort of like the propaganda message that we're going to promulgate. This bush is decidedly pro-German, is decidedly disloyal, it's a dangerous enemy alien, and every citizen should do their share to get rid of them for patriotic cereal crops. All right. So World War I is over. It doesn't make as much sense to demonize the Kaiser. Who do we got? Oh, Bolsheviks, anarchists. Right? What goes from being king of the Kaiser becomes the red-headed anarchist of the grain fields. So it was the Germans, and now it's the commies threatening our crops. So the government responds with this type of propaganda, but also with mass mobilization at home, the so-called rust busters. I'm making none of this up, people. This is all true. But rust buster clubs were formed throughout the Midwest where kids would go out on the weekend and uproot barberry bushes. They gave them medals for this. They had barberry bees where you get together, and instead of putting up a barn, you'd uproot these plants. We're going really far afield here, bear with me, but this was so endemic throughout the U.S. that come the Cold War, when the U.S. is trying to think of new and nefarious ways to attack its foes, we were first concerned about the Soviets using stem rust against us, wiping out our crops, and somebody had the bright idea of deploying it ourselves, basically bombarding Ukraine and other targets with stem rust projectiles, hoping to wipe out their crops. That 25 million starving Ukrainians with AK-47s would be a bad thing apparently didn't occur to people much at the time. And the program goes on well after the war, right? We've got, this is one of the reports filled out by surveyors. They would go to people's houses, survey it for barberry bushes, which are really, they're tenacious bushes. They'll come back generations later on if you don't monitor them. And they would report on location of bushes on people's property, and then also some details about the owner. Most notably, the attitude of the owner is good in this case. He doesn't mind the government stomping on his land, looking for bad plants. I should note. Whoops, sorry. I should note that my research on stem rust has been greatly assisted by Riley Barlow and Lizzie Ferry, two of my former students. Thank you for that work on my behalf. So, close parenthesis. Sorry about that. I could go on for hours about stem rust. That's my next project. I'll have to get Caroline to ask me back if you want to hear more. If you want to hear more about that serial killer. So, Prohibition. We are the flappers, of course. Here's some dancing on the end of the skyscraper. Don't ask me why. Prohibition does actually have some interesting effects on gender roles, because previously women couldn't drink in public. They couldn't drink in saloons, but in speakeasies, when drinking is already legal, what's to stop women from joining men in them, right? So it actually breaks down gendered norms on drinking, and of course also leads to the rise of organized crime, most notably in the form of Al Capone, who, if you believe all the stories about Capone in Wisconsin, he's been to practically every town here. We know we did stay at the hotel in Lake Como. That's that photograph briefly in the 20s, I think, right? So good news for flappers, good news for immigrants who find organized crime is one way to make money. But by the 1930s, there is a more widespread consensus that prohibition simply was not working. We see here, whoops, going the wrong way now. So you see, the prohibition is here, stomping its way through this grain field, and it's responsible, hand in hand with the gangsters, the racketeers, the bootleggers, even the dope sellers. That is obviously the prohibition is seen now as the source of many social ills. It's really difficult to enforce as well, right? Especially when certain states when certain states stop observing prohibition, even if the federal government still is. Wisconsin prohibition ends at the state level in 1929. And after that, state officials, when the feds come by, they say, you're on your own. We have other things to do with our efforts. Long story short, by the election of 1932, prohibition is widely seen as a failure. And thus, FDR makes one part of his platform repeal, right? Put me into office, and I'm going to go ahead and legalize drinking again. And then I think this is a great photograph. Prohibition ends at last. Everybody gets to raise a glass, right? So let me go ahead and sum up a bit here. There's no one cause of prohibition, right? Think of it instead as a perfect storm of causes. On the one hand, we have sort of the longer term. We've got the WCTU and ASL mobilizing the population via propaganda to vote against alcohol. And again, half this country is dry before prohibition proper ever goes into effect at the federal level, right? Economically, we have the income tax reform in 1913 makes breweries no longer sort of the goose that brews the golden beer for the U.S. government. But it's really World War I, the combination of rationing, especially this anti-German sentiment that I think that's the missing last element in this complex set of causes, right? Just for the record, repeal was one of the more popular things FDR ever did. Prohibition is repealed on the 22nd of March. Within 2 days, the government has made $10 million in tax revenue. By August, $54 million. So FDR was popular for a lot of reasons. I'm pretty sure this is one of the major ones. So let me come back around to that second myth that, again, I think most people think about prohibition, and that's that it didn't work, right? Yes, people managed to find their way to get drinks, right, and speakeasies or bathtub gin. The border with Canada is pretty permeable. Ditto Mexico. People can still get drinks. So if we're going to judge prohibition in terms of did it absolutely stop everybody from drinking any of the time, sure, it's a fail in that regard. But if we look at per capita consumption, comparing 1913 to 1934, we see that the consumption of beer drops by more than half. Consumption of spirits drops to a third of what it was in that last year of fully legal drinking. Those levels of consumption, we don't get back up to those until 1970. Okay, so again, if we judge prohibition as in holistic terms, if one guy gets a drink, it's broken, versus a public policy measure, we want Americans to start drinking less, I got to call it a success, right? I mean, a lasting one that had an immediate impact, one that lasted well past prohibition proper, right? In terms of modern parallels, I think the most obvious one is for cannabis, where many states have legalized it for either medical or recreational purposes. And going back to the Prohibition Act, there's the interstate loophole. I mean, marijuana isn't legal in this state, but you could drive west or north or south, and you'll find yourself in a state where it is, right? So one wonders how effective keeping it illegal is. Likewise, drugs like LSD and psilocybin, I mean, demonized after the 1960s and hippies run amok. Both have been found in recent studies to have remarkable success rates in treating PTSD and other mental issues. So there's another case where I think that there's this sort of the bias against it that's keeping us from using it for its scientific purposes, right? Okay, let's go ahead and move to, how much time do I have left?
Yeah. 30 minutes.
Oh, geez, I've been flying. Okay, good. Lots of times for Q&A. This is great. So turn now to World War II. The CPI's counterpart now is the Office of War Information. And of course, in the meantime, we've seen the advent of cinema, so that newsreels can be deployed for propaganda purposes. The best example of this is Frank Capra's Why We Fight, an 11-volume newsreel series. You can find on YouTube. It's fascinating to look at how consent is manufactured in World War II as well. But even cartoons, there's a Donald Duck cartoon called The Spirit of 43, where Donald's being urged to pay his taxes by Scrooge McDuck, and the guy trying to get him to spend his money is this sort of zoot suitor who the door to his bar, of course, is his bow tie are both, of course, swastikas. And he looks more than a bit like Hitler, as much as a duck can, anyway. So let's think back to what we saw in World War I propaganda, right? We see manipulating gender norms. We see prescriptive messages trying to get people trying to get people to do specific things. Let's see how this maps onto World War II now. Okay. So again, the child under threat is kind of this central image that is used and recycled and reused by many government propaganda agencies throughout the course of history. Right here on the left, we've got this little girl saying a prayer that turns into a call for people to produce for victory. And on the right, folks, if you don't want that poor child to be crushed by that falling swastika, you better give us some money in the form of war bonds, right? Here, playing upon gender norms here again on the left, in this case, sort of like drawing upon the sort of the danger of female sexuality and getting people to give up top secret or confidential information. That is, shut up and do what you're told. Likewise, don't kill her daddy. This shameless. It's almost preposterous in retrospect how blatantly this plays upon the heartstrings, like melodrama almost, right? But don't kill daddy with careless talk. Okay, we're talking about gender norms. I'm into World War II. Who can guess where I'm going next? Anybody? Thank you. Exactly right. How many of you have seen this ever before? Right? Okay, so this archetypal image of women going to work in World War II, right? And so again, this is going against more traditional female roles as homemakers in the kitchen, what have you, was also really, really, really successful. World War II was good. As in World War I, when men, mostly white men, are off at the front, although over 1 million African Americans served in World War II in segregated battalions. This opens up a lot of jobs back home, right? In traditionally masculine coded, and much more high paying as a result jobs. You've got women working in factories. You have African American and Anglo women working together. African American men get good jobs as well. And there's even the Bracero program for bringing Mexicans to work in the fields in mostly the American Southwest, right? So this is a boom for people traditionally excluded from leading roles in industry. And then so there's a real opportunity for many women, as it had been in World War I, but to a much greater extent. We're in World War II from 41 to 45. This is not to say that we entirely get rid of the patriarchy that pervades earlier ads. I got good work, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job. Turns out they can. And on the right, more of an appeal to the ladies. My girl's a women ordnance worker. The message here being, of course, if you go off and get work in a factory, well, you'll land yourself a good man after the war, right? So the propaganda in World War II, I think it is similar to World War I in these regards. Let's look at what we do with sort of some of the other countries involved in this conflict. Yeah, we invent new allies. That is, Stalin makes the cover of Time magazine a couple times during the war. Meanwhile, on the right, this is one of the cards that were handed out to GIs, sort of helping them recognize the uniforms of other soldiers. And this man, this Red Army soldier, is your friend. He fights for freedom, which he fights to support Stalin's USSR, which has murdered more of its own people by the time World War II starts than Hitler ever will in the Holocaust, right? But that's not that. A, that doesn't fit on a card, and B, it's not much help in convincing people that the Russians are on our side. So inventing new allies, recycling old ones. I promise you some Hitler. Here's our can't have a talk on propaganda without Hitler. But so again, there's this sort of outright demonization of the enemy, a murdered woman, crying defenseless child. You could get rid of Hitler, put the Kaiser in here, and be World War I all over again, right? We also see these prescriptive messages again, right? That is that sort of when you ride alone, ride with Hitler. I tell my students this all the time. Urging people to car sharing, to save a ride, save on gas, right? Conserve that gas for the war effort. So in some regards, very similar to World War I, right? The one thing that I think is very different in how our enemies are portrayed is the the really racial aspect of anti-German, anti-Jap in the pejorative label of the time propaganda. So on the left, another one of these prescriptive messages: prevent forest fires. Again, not something you expect to find in wartime propaganda, but it's obviously they obviously are caused by these foes, Hitler and Tojo. Now, I mean, they're both obviously evil, but I think it's also apparent that the Anglo-European enemy is depicted simply as another person. The Asiatic Japanese is given these animalistic, almost rat-like features, right? The same is true on the right. Again, simple prescriptive message: drive safely, people. But coupled with this racist depiction of the Japanese foe, right? Likewise, again, simple messages: go ahead and take the day off. Japanese love it when you don't show up to work. If we conserve materials, we're going to be able to catch that rodent, the so-called, again, Jap trap. This is, I mean, it's always striking for us to look back at how messages that today rightly are seen, I think, is just profoundly racist. But at the time, it made total sense for people trying to get, for propagandists trying to get people to do things to draw upon these racial, this body of racial imagery, right? In order to keep the Japanese from attacking our women, invest 10% of your salary in war bonds. It's tough to see how those two things go together. And on the right, simply more demonization of this simian alien figure carting off a helpless Anglo woman, right? This is all wartime propaganda, but it's playing upon, I think, pre-existing anti-Japanese and Japanese-American sentiment, right? And of course, at this time, this woman put this up of her own, on her own. Nobody told her to do it. She thought it was a good idea. It would appeal to her neighbors. Japanese Americans' property was vandalized on a regular basis. And this is all 1939, 1940. And mostly in California, right? For the most part, most of the Japanese American population is in California. And most of the camps that we built for them were also in California. The striking, this next photograph, I think, is one of the more striking ones that I've seen from World War II. It's a number of school children saying the Pledge of Allegiance in a San Francisco school in 1940. And we can see a broad swath of different ethnicities here, right? Anglo, Asian, Latino, and even African American. Which in 1940, I mean, if you were anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, you would not have people of different color skin going to the same schools, right? So what comes next, of course, is internment. Japanese Americans are rounded up and sent off to camps. Here we have some of the children flashing the V for Victory sign and waving flags as they're being sent to camps like this one, in which they spend the bulk of the war. The one way out of the camps for Japanese Americans was that young Japanese American men could volunteer for the army, and they served with distinction at the Battle of the Bulge. Took massive casualties in that last major battle of World War II. Okay, I've kind of gone off topic again. I apologize for that. Let me bring it on back to beer as I try to wrap things up here. So long story short, nothing at all like what we saw in World War I happens in World War II. The brewers, the beer, although not liquor, is included in GI's rations, although in sort of really drab-colored cans, so that snipers couldn't catch the flash off them. And support for the war turns out to be a good advertising gambit for the American brewers, right? Here's Schlitz. Every fourth bottle of Schlitz goes overseas to our soldiers, right, to support the war effort. On the right, thinking Americans today are not too free with free speech. Shut up and drink, brought to you by Budweiser. Right? But look, I mean, just seriously, this is the same message. Give me a second. Yeah, sorry. Shut up and behave, right? And then if you shut up and behave, you can get a beer at the end of the day. All right. So some World War II, some locales, some states do try to. There's a couple of counties, couple of cities here and there that do ban alcohol consumption again during World War II. But for the most part, there's no serious attempt to do a federal ban. This is very isolated places. It just doesn't. The polar opposite from World War I, right? Prohibition is so obviously a bad idea that Dr. Seuss lampoons these attempts to bring back prohibition with this your nutty Aunt Carrie with that axe. It's loose again, right? Here she is. Seuss is actually a very political artist. If you go back and look at some of his work, he's really making pointed commentaries on the way Americans think and act a lot of the time. And so this brings us somewhat back to where we started. Rosie the Riveters drinking a beer after work, right? Rheingold, the Rheingold Girl of the Year for 1942, of course, also drawing upon this wartime message to sell product, right? So there's just some biases between advertising and propaganda we could talk about more in the Q&A. Okay, so what? What was the point of all this? What's stimulus got to do anything? Not much yet is my answer to that. But so what we can see is propaganda being deployed both in peacetime by private groups, activists primarily, and also in wartime by governments, right? So despite these two very different purposes, despite these two very different agents behind this process, they end up using some of the same iconography, some of the same means of persuasion, right? Our children are in danger. Women are also victimized by either the bottle or the Hun. Take your pick, right? To me, the similarities between peacetime temperance propaganda and wartime anti-German propaganda are really, I think, they're strikingly similar, which I think is really interesting to me. The other thing is just this broad panoply of tools and images and narratives that were deployed by both temperance movements and the government to manufacture and sustain support. You appeal to the family and threats to it. You appeal to the nation and threats to it. These also are common between peacetime and wartime propaganda for these two different goals. And then, again, lastly, I think the one thing to come out of this whole narrative is that by World War II, the U.S. government has definitely learned its lesson. We're not going to try banning alcohol again. We're actually going to use it to maintain our troops' morale in the field and the American and American economy at home. If I could just close with the immortal words of George W. Bush, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, well, you're not going to fool me again. Thank you for your time. We have all kinds of time for questions, please. O'Reilly.
So given your contention that one of the motivating factors for prohibition or getting it passed is this anti-German sentiment that applies to those beer brewing companies, how do they escape that in World War II, given that we are once again at war with Germans?
Right. The question was asking about the anti-German sentiment in World War I and how we don't end up doing that in World War II because we're fighting the Germans again. Let's see. We still use anti-German propaganda in World War II, of course, but I think the best way to answer that is that, again, prohibition is a perfect storm of all these different things going on. Anti-German sentiment is only one of those things. So it occupies a central role in propaganda in both contexts, but in this case, it's not deployed towards non-directly war-related phenomena, right? It's not being used to ban. It's being used to get Americans to do what they're told. To go to work, women especially go work in the factories. It's not. It's these other elements, these other factors that I think are missing in World War II, right? Also, and it's also, coming after prohibition, we tried that once. We're not going to do it. Nobody liked it. Most people didn't really like it much. We have to write. Organized crime. This is the origin of organized crime, right? Well, bro, it was really the major element leading to the rise of Capone, all these other gangs. That was I think that was also probably weighing on people's minds in one of the major elements that made it different from World War I. Make sense? Cool, thank you. I had a hand over here.
preface this, my grandfather fought in World War One on the American side, but it was a very difficult time for Germans and German Lutherans, as in the steeple of First German Lutheran Church, which you can see outside the window.
Uh-huh.
Most of the German Lutherans were already here a couple generations, but their religion, they loved it, that they had learned as children and had passed on, was still by and large German till the war changed. And to show their loyalty, all of a sudden American flags are in sanctuaries.
Uh-huh.
And liturgical people are saying, what in the world are you putting a political national flag in a sanctuary where you're supposed to be worshiping something else? But it was to show we're with you somewhat. Although before the war, president of German Lutheran College in Minnesota was with a group opposing getting involved in the war, and within a week after he stood on a platform with some others, he was asked to resign. Not told, he was told he was going to resign because this would be very negative to the college. We didn't experience what the Japanese experienced, but it was a tough time to be a German in that time. Although not everybody. I wish I could today talk to my grandfather and say, hey, you went to German Lutheran school, you this and that. Why? Well, he didn't enlist. He got drafted in the 32nd.
Thank you. The question had to do with how Germans, how German American communities sort of dealt with this new sort of anti-German sentiment, right? That is that there was some that churches all of a sudden sprout flags in them, sort of like proving Germans to be good Americans, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is the Liberty Loan. Adam Azzolino, my student who looks at the BOI in Sheboygan and elsewhere, he found cases where people would go around to German American households and urge them to subscribe for the peace loan, or else, right? So it's sort of the way you can prove you're a good American, give us some of that money, right? And so I think that there's a lot of, and look, I mean, as you note also, I mean, a lot of German Americans have lived here since first started coming over in 1848, right? And
here, not so much. Here, by 1970.
Not much. They're about. I mean,
there's also a master's thesis written by the son of a Lutheran pastor, and the title of the thesis is World War I: The War to End All Germans. And he documents all these illegal things that FBI predecessor did, and they sit in churches. And because they wanted to catch you saying something anti-American,
right?
And they report, well, they just talked about religion.
Right. I mean, and I think that the question or follow up was about how, again, sort of how there is this real deliberate sort of like surveillance of German American populations, and this is there's all kinds of evidence that supports this now that. This also is very absent World War II. Well, the German Americans are not as suspect in World War II as they are in World War I. Some of it does come back to, I think, the racism we see in a lot of this.
They've been here another generation. They've been educated at American public high schools.
I'd like some other questions, please. Yeah, great.
Yeah, so we have a question from Sarah here.
Mhm.
She asks, how did Prohibition impact the social and economic fabric of Wisconsin? And what lasting effects, if any, can still be observed in the state's culture and industries?
Wow. Love the two-part question. I feel like I was not told I was going to get serious questions. This is hard. So the impact of Prohibition in Wisconsin and lasting
the economic fabric and social fabric of Wisconsin.
Good. The one thing that I'm looking at right now in the district court cases from Milwaukee and Madison, going back to 1918 onwards, is that, I mean, much like Prohibition didn't happen overnight, it didn't go into effect overnight either. I mean, I found a number of sources of breweries that are still brewing and getting busted for it by the BOI in 1921, 22. And then Fred Rahr Brewing up in Green Bay kept going until late 22. And when the feds finally busted him, they threw the book at him. He had 54 different counts of him brewing without permission, selling to various different people. And what we know from his record books is probably one of the reasons that he was able to keep going for so long was that one of his major customers was local Elks Club and various other sort of local organizations. So the people's interest in still having access to alcohol was way more important than doing what they were told by the government. We see the same with a number of other breweries as well. So smaller breweries, which in smaller towns are a major source of employment, right? Even if you don't work in a brewery, you know somebody who does, and you know them as well. And they're more closer to you than the feds coming in from DC to tell you what to do, right? So it is. I mean, it does. It's. I really need to look at more records from other states to say how Wisconsin's experience of prohibition was different. But broadly speaking, we have move in drinking from saloons to speakeasies. And again, this breaks down the gender boundaries between women drinking in the same place as men. That's true in Wisconsin as well as elsewhere. The lasting effects. It's hard to say. Well, one major thing that happens is that up until 1920, Wisconsin had more. Back up. What's happening from about the 1880s on is conglomeration in the brewing industry, right? The big ones, especially Schlitz and Pabst and Budweiser, the two biggest from the 19th century. They're gobbling up smaller breweries. They're undercutting their prices. They're forcing others out of business, right? And this is less apparent in Wisconsin than elsewhere, but as smaller regional breweries like Leinenkugel's and others manage to keep going in the face of this corporate conglomeration, right? So this remains true after Prohibition as well. I mean, Wisconsin has more breweries that remain independent from the big players for longer than anybody else. But that's, I mean, there we get into the economics of brewing and sort of the tactics that the breweries used against each other, and that's that wasn't part of this talk. So I'm glad I had a chance to sneak it in. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry, Riley, can we do her first?
Are there any dry counties yet?
Most of Utah, I think. Or I was joking, but I might be serious. There are still dry counties. Oh yeah. The county in Kentucky where Jack Daniels is distilled?
They're no longer dry.
Well, progress finally comes to Kentucky.
Yeah, the workers from there would have to drive over to another county to buy what they were producing.
Well,
They could sell it there, but you couldn't taste it.
Well, and if you buy a bottle at the Jack Daniels distillery, as I did back in 1995,
Right,
I obeyed the law and crossed the county line before I cracked it.
right,
There you go,
Right.
that's what it was, right, yeah.
and now they can.
Well, I mean, I think there are. I mean, I don't know of any offhand. I mean, it seems it's maybe in West Texas, a couple places.
They want.
Maybe in West Texas, a couple places. That's a great question. I'll have to look into that. Thank you, sir.
Ephraim was dry up until I think last year.
What was?
As a city, Ephraim.
Ephraim from York County.
I'll be darned. Well, see again. I mean, so that town's dry, but you drive 5 minutes.
About a year ago.
Okay.
They actually voted to end that.
Better late than never. All right.
Hey.
Excellent. Riley, another question?
yeah, so you argue that Prohibition had found success sort of in the propaganda that it uses towards the public to manufacture consent
Mhm.
for the banning of alcohol. How much of that is actually successfully manufacturing consent within the public versus just putting pressure on the government to ban alcohol? Because from everything you've been saying, it sounds like as Prohibition goes into effect, a lot of counties are going dry. They're facing pushback from the public that is going to eventually cause Prohibition to be repealed by more public outcry. So how much of that is actually effective propaganda on the public versus just pressure on the governmental systems to affect that like top down?
Oh, good. Good question. Sorry, the question from frontline viewers was this propaganda, was it more important, or how did it differ in terms of the means of appealing to people versus actually forcing government action? right? I think this is where this is a useful way to look at the difference between the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, right? The former is mostly trying to promote popular support. The latter, again, lobby group. They will go. They're targeting legislators who will vote dry and attacking the ones that will vote that want to go wet. Yeah, I think that's it. And the thing is, this again comes back to income tax. I mean, as long as alcohol was so important, nobody. I mean, cutting off your nose to spite your liver, right? But yeah. And there in the back, sir.
Maybe for further discussion, the first map you showed, it was pretty much 90 days between temperance, the prohibitionists, and those that wanted to drink. I kind of wonder if that was cultural, ethnic, geographic.
Hold up, let me find that map. So I'm sure we're talking about the same thing. The first, where most of the countries.
Actually, you must have, I think it was better.
This one, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. Your question was what?
Why some states,
Why?
were drinking and others were against it?
Yeah. I can tell you. Well, I think the Dakotas, the Dakotas go dry because I think they're the first to go dry because their populations are pretty malleable. Little money goes a long ways when you're, or little persuasion goes a long ways when you're trying to convince people to do something new. And then the West staying wet. I think, this is not that long after it was the frontier, right? I mean, there's who was the hanging judge of Amarillo? What was his name again? There was Is that it? Right. So I think that the law, and the Western states might have more of a proclivity to push back against this type of thing. Now, once we get down south and into Eastern Seaboard, it's hard to say. Do you think? The broader question, I think one of the broader issues here that I always talk about in the class I teach on drugs and drinking is, prohibition. The prohibition, what Americans call capital P prohibition, was unique in as much as that was the one time that white men couldn't drink what and where they wanted to, right? Women couldn't drink in public until, ironically enough, during Prohibition. If you're Native American, every day is Prohibition, right? The alcohol sales to Native Americans are illegal for much of this story. I found cases in the Madison District Court archives where somebody busted for selling a pint of whiskey on a reservation got fined $100 and did a month in jail. $100 and $19-20 is pretty significant, right? If we think, what I'm getting at here is, prohibition, the way that we think about it, I think is the tip of the iceberg of having to do with who gets to drink what, with whom, and where. And I think that this is sociologists talk about the third space, right? There's some place outside of work and home that you can also that you can mobilize for political effect or join organizations or go bowling, right? There's the famous book by Bob Putnam about bowling alone in America, right? So I think so prohibition, I think when we look at its socio-political aspects, this is one of the ways that non-white, non-male populations have been kept away out of sort of broader social functions. The reason that I got off on that tangent is because in the South, many politicians are very concerned about keeping African Americans from drinking. And that's a racial element of prohibition that is more prevalent there than elsewhere, right? Sir.
I would like to believe that prohibition it didn't say anything about you can't drink alcohol. You just couldn't manufacture it. You couldn't sell and manufacture it. But if you had 48 cases started in your basement, what the heck, go down there and drink all you want.
Well, speakeasies got raided on a regular basis. Sorry. The question was about whether prohibition bans drinking or just the production of alcohol. And there, if we look at the records, there's a lot of raids of speakeasies. A lot of times those are people that forgot to pay the police their bribe that month because crime just oozes out of every pore of this whole narrative, right? But there was, I mean, whether or not it was illegal, there were still real controls on drinking as well. Absolutely. Sir.
I can explain Michigan. I lived 10 years in Michigan and why it's partially. There is a strong European Lutheran Catholic element, which were pro-alcohol, but around Grand Rapids.
Catholics more so than Lutherans, right?
There were Dutch Reformed and Calvin University and other places which were strongly anti-drink, religious. So, and I assume Ohio would be the same, that even that stands out as an island there. And the thing is, they tended to live in separate areas. The Reformed type people are in the Grand Rapids area. And if you look at that other map of Michigan, where it was, that one, all the white are mostly in more Reformed type areas.
Right. So the question or statement was about why Michigan was partially dry back in 1893, and much of this comes down to religious affiliation. Lutherans are much more likely to go dry than Catholics. Now that's
and much less likely to go dry than Dutch Reformed or Calvin.
Right. Thank you. More questions, please. What do we got? Lizzie.
We've got another question from our online viewers. From Walter, he asks, in World War I, how did they separate the anti-German propaganda of beer-making country from the lack of propaganda against the Irish who were whiskey makers?
Well,
that's kind of a loaded question.
Wait, the Irish are sorry. The question was, why is there anti-German propaganda in World War I and not anti-Irish? We're not at war with Ireland. I mean, it's just off the top of my head, that's what I got. I mean, there's still all kinds of opprobrium and racism directed towards Irish as well. I mean, think about all the signs that we've seen, like no Irish dogs allowed, right? Common signs in bars. So, and this comes back to thinking about prohibition in a broader context. Being Irish would keep you out of certain bars, keep you out of contact with certain people, keep you excluded from that third space more, right? But I mean, so the anti-Irish sentiment is definitely a part of controlling who drinks what, where, and when with whom. But in World War I, it just doesn't. That dog don't hunt. I don't think it matters. Thank you, Walter.
Could you bring up that picture of Prohibition ending?
Oh, sure. Where is that? Hey, too far.
One with the
With the guy tipping the glass. There we are.
The NRA, is that the NRA or is that something else?
It is the NRA, but it's the National Recovery Act. This was a measure in I think it was during the Depression, but prior to World War II, that and this again comes back to government's manufacturing consent, or in this case, forcing businesses to go along with government policies. That is, or rather, encouraging, using a carrot rather than a stick. This NRA, the National Recovery Act from the Great Depression, this is a program where businesses would join it, and they get this little blue eagle on a plaque to put up in their windows, and that showed that they were on board with the New Deal scheme. So it's always weird to go back and look at the 30s, and we have these frankly fascist-looking eagles. It's only a gear in one claw and a hammer in the other one, and that's American, not Nazi Germany. It's kind of weird. Thank you. Good eye. Any last questions? Lizzie has a question. You in the back.
What's your favorite piece of propaganda from this entire presentation?
Oh, geez. Wait, from this one? Man, that's a trick. That's a hard one. I do tend to, full disclosure, some nights I'll crack a homebrew and just go down the rabbit hole of looking at propaganda. It's one of the occupational hazards of being a historian. Lizzie, I probably have to go with the red-handed anarchist, just because that ties into my interest in the Soviet experience as well. But yeah, it's just and that's just one of those moments where you find it in the archives, or one of your students finds it for you in the archives, and it just poses this like, how did that make sense to somebody at that time to put those images together, right? And this is kind of one of those things that really got me interested in this topic. So this is my favorite, probably, I would say. But I mean, it's for historians, it's great as a type of source that lets us unpack all of these kind of rich fields of meaning, based on gender difference, class, national identity, and other things. So yeah, thank you. And also in the back, sorry.
So during Prohibition, right, people probably made beer at home a lot more.
More.
I think that led to more interest in making traditional style beers.
Oh, don't get me started. Nope, you did. Okay, so most home production during Prohibition is going to be spirits, most often gin. Although what you find in early 1920 is a real shortage in stores of raisins, and many of the records that I found of arrests, having a couple bags of raisins on hand was itself evidence that you're running a still. Raisins, of course, are just packets of pure sugar, great fermentables, right? So the first thing that happened in Prohibition is the store shelves were emptied of raisins. They become evidence of a crime, like CSI Sheboygan or something, bags of raisins hidden behind the garage or something. And then, so point being, breweries would brew near beer. That is a beer of less than, I think it had to be less than 1% alcohol. At the time it was even less, I think. But a number of breweries, I think, would have a license to brew near beer, and then when the feds are out of sight, they'd fire up the brew house for a regular batch, right? So in terms of different styles of beer, though, what you have by 1893, when Pabst gets the blue ribbon at the Chicago Expo, the American light lager, the light lager, Pilsner, if you want to call it that, is a standard American mass-produced style. That's going to dominate the American market until after 1978, when Jimmy Carter legalizes homebrewing. And this leads to the explosion of not only homebrewing, but also craft brewing today, right? I mean, we owe, thank you, Jimmy Carter, for that one. Having quoted both Jimmy Carter and George Bush today, I'm calling this a success. I would like to thank Caroline again for inviting me to talk here. And thank you all for having been a lovely audience.
Thank you so much for coming out. I would like to just do one more round of applause for our excellent speaker. That was a great time. If you like this talk, we've got a really exciting one next month as well. So next month we are going to be having the author Rick Baer come and talk about the Ghost Army, which is a time in which during World War II, the military got a whole bunch of like artists and set designers and things like that to make like inflatable tanks and things like that to trick the Nazis. So that's
Before D-Day.
Yes,
Oh,
very interesting talk.
Very
It'll be
cool.
super cool. So that will be next month, the first Thursday, which is like October 5th. Yes, October 5th. So that will be super cool. Also, if you enjoyed this talk, and I'll stand right over here. If you guys enjoyed this talk and want to see more like it here at the museum, please consider supporting. Supporting can come in so many different ways. It can mean donating, becoming a member, volunteering, or just telling all of your friends and family about how awesome you thought this talk was and letting them know that there are other cool things here at the museum. If you guys enjoyed your beers, you want to try more local beers, I will say that Sub Pub is open until 9 tonight, so you can go up to our roof deck and try some of our other beer options. But yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Folks, we also get a round of applause for Caroline, Lizzie, Riley, Greg, and the other folks who work here at the Maritime Museum.